Have you ever wanted to play a grimy early thousands horror crime thriller like Seven mixed with a first-person brawler? Then I think you'll enjoy Condemned Criminal Origins. For the most part. I say that because past the excellent atmosphere and plenty of great ideas, Condemned stumbles quite a bit through the roughly 4-hour playthrough. Set in the fictional city of Metro, a city quickly being taken over by the raw and decay of crime, you play as FBI agent Ethan Thomas. After witnessing the death of two fellow law officers and having their deaths pinned on his name, Ethan must set out across the disease-ridden city to put a stop to a serial killer and a plot that is more than it seems. For the most part, the story of the game is fairly solid, if not a bit predictable and out of the way, at least for the first 2/3. It's a chilling fun time to play as a special forces agent on the run who still has to do his job because he is committed to upholding the law. However, while I won't spoil anything here, I will say that if you don't like supernatural elements being forced into a setting that relies on realism, you will be quite disappointed with the shift Condemned takes in the latter half of the game. Ethan Thomas is a fine protagonist, and everyone else, like the likes of Rosa, who is Ethan's support, the mysterious Malcolm, and the other few characters are just fine. Honestly, the cast is pretty lacking in personality outside the fact that the majority of them aren't awful people. Milquetoast is probably the best word I can use to describe everyone. On the villain side of things, the main bad guy, out of a few of them, Serial Killer X, is a neat idea, since it's always cool to see an anti-hero sort of villain, but like the heroes, he's just bland. The gameplay to the game is a combination of a janky FPS game and a first-person brawler with a heavy dose of incredibly basic puzzles. Ethan has a very limited moveset where he can kick, swing his weapon, block loosely, and for most of the game use his standard issue and later upgraded taser. Melee is fun for most of the game, with each hit that actually lands feeling relatively solid and meaty. I do like that if you manage to stun an enemy, you're able to rip their weapons out of their hands, and it'll take them a second before they reorient themselves to go grab another weapon, allowing you to get a few hits in. You can get your hands on a wide variety of objects from around the environment, each with their own similar, yet varied stats. Things like pipes, axes, sledgehammers, and basically anything laying around can be used to dispatch enemies. This is for the most part fun, but it was annoying to constantly switch from your preferred weapon to a weapon needed for an environmental puzzle. While I was glad that weapons didn't break outside when you were using the butt of your gun, it was frustrating to constantly have to swap weapons, especially when you found one you felt comfortable with. If you managed to wind an enemy and knock them onto their knees with a heavy attack, you get the chance to do one of 4 enjoyable enough finishing moves. You can also get your hands on firearms, but these are short-lived, as once they run out of ammo, the only thing you can do with them is use their butts as a last-ditch melee weapon until you quickly find a new, stronger one. My one gripe with the guns is not the lack of reloading, as I like the limited feel they have. No, I dislike the fact that they all feel like they are doing is firing salt rounds. Most of the guns take several hits to take down clearly human, barely clothed targets, which is really annoying when your kick sometimes does more damage. It's a minor complaint I have about the guns, but it can feel cheap. The taser for the first half of the game is non-lethal, but good for stunning targets. After it gets its deadly upgrade, it became a whole lot more fun when you basically get a free hit. This helps make fights when enemies ganged up on you feel more fair. The enemies you'll fight over the course of the game range from drugged up squatters to lunatics to straight up otherworldly mutants. The progression gets a bit too silly and peaks in creepiness factor in the department store, but outside the heavy hitting fat enemies, they were each fun to fight. Something I noticed while playing the game that I thought was really cool is that sometimes enemies will go back and pick up better weapons that either you dropped or their comrades dropped, and I thought that was a really nice touch that they would go for the more powerful weapon to take you out. The enemies weren't exactly the smartest I've ever seen in a game, but there was enough intelligence here to make them not completely brain dead, which I appreciated. Outside of having to smash or break things in your way with specific weapons, there are also the forensic puzzles you will partake in. Outside of the word search in the barn house near the end of the game, playing the semi-realistic, semi-sci-fi role of a detective and finding gruesome clues here was a neat idea. And although the investigation elements are a bit too on rails, I still like feeling involved with what was going on. There were a few collectibles such as the dead birds or random bits of metal that you find hidden behind things, and there were also the immersion-breaking Xbox collectibles you find scattered around the map for no real reason. In terms of the environments, everything fit the bill, and despite it being a chore to play through, the final level was not something you see all that often. Each and every subway or apartment you made your way through was disgusting and claustrophobic, and while the game was incredibly linear, it made sense with how things were laid out. Visually, the game has aged quite a bit, and despite it coming out after Fear, it easily looks a lot worse than it. It's not the worst game I've ever seen, and some of the lighting and levels look decent, but with the reuse of props from Fear and how ugly the normal human characters look here, it just hasn't aged well. Also, the game has a tendency of being way too dark, even when you turn up the brightness. While it's not impossible to find your way around, it's not always fun to have to squint to see exactly where you're going, especially with the fact that some of the levels are a bit maze-like. Sound and voice acting all around is fine. Sometimes the ambient sounds rely a bit too hard on being spooky, like using children's laughter or the like. but it's nothing too offensive. The music is forgettable and dingy, but fitting enough, and the voice acting was generic like the characters themselves.
Rosa, are you still there?
Very few people can tell me to shut up and get away with it.
Sorry, I'll be there in a couple minutes.
Hurry. I have a feeling I'm not alone here.
But again, it wasn't bad, or anything worse than middle of the road most of the time. Alright, a few spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled, jump to the timestamp provided on screen. Anyone who wants to avoid spoilers gone? Good. On we go. From the horribly cheap and clunky final boss fight, to the confusing sequel bait hook that we get instead of a proper ending, right down to the useless moral choice. I just didn't care for any of this. It just felt like the devs ran out of time instead of crafting something more fulfilling. And with all that said, Condemned Criminal Origins isn't perfect, but the few flaws it has will only begin to bother you right as the game is wrapping up. It's not the scariest or smartest horror game, but it manages to maintain the atmosphere it was going for. It's cheap, short, and if you're in the mood for being spooked for a few hours on the weekend, you can't really go wrong here. As always, if you want to help support the channel, please consider sharing the video with a friend or checking out my Patreon linked in the description below. A big thank you to my wonderful friend Orion Knight for drawing up these wonderful animation stills of Punish Neat. If you have any comments, questions, or recommendations, leave them in the comments as I read and reply to everything. Until next time, this is Thierry Williamson signing off until the next video. See ya guys!